Championship, Chapter 16, entitled The Potato Clock. Mr. Sparks glanced toward the broken wall clock at the start of the next lab. "Potato chip time," he declared. The emphasis on the word time, plus the glance, caught Leon's attention. He could smell lame jokes a mile off. "This is something to do with that clock, doesn't it, Mr. Sparks?" "It does indeed, Leon. We can't have a science lab without proper timekeepers." Mr. Sparks turned to the blackboard. "Here's what we'll do to remedy the problem." He wrote, 1 potato, 1 empty potato chip can, 2 copper pennies, 2 galvanized nails, 1 battery-operated digital clock, batteries not included, 3 alligator clip wires. Antoinette Breed's hand shot up faster than a bottle rocket. "Aren't you forgetting something, Mr. Sparks?" "What would that be, Antoinette?" "The batteries, of course. How can we run a battery-operated clock without batteries?" "Do you remember what I said about using 'of course'?" said Mr. Sparks. "That it's not scientific," said Antoinette. "Correct," said Mr. Sparks. "I did not forget about the batteries. In fact, I listed them first." All eyes turned to the blackboard. "Potatoes?" everyone shouted. "Potatoes," Mr. Sparks confirmed before passing out a handout. How to make a potato clock. Cut 2 1-inch rings off a potato chip can. 2. Cut a potato in half. 3. Sit potato halves on the 2 rings. 4. Jab a penny halfway into each potato half. 5. Jab a galvanized nail into each potato half, making sure to pick a spot far away from the penny. 6. Clamp one end of the first alligator clip wire to the penny and the other end to one of the battery terminals on the digital clock. 7. Attach one end of the second alligator clip wire to the galvanized nail and the other end to the other battery terminal of the clock. 8. Take the last alligator clip wire and attach one end to the nail of one potato and the other end to the penny of the other potato. 9. Set the time. "Potatoes are going to make the clocks tick?" said Flossie Parmigiano skeptically. "You got it," said Mr. Sparks. "Spuds are jam-packed with electrolytes, which means they're an excellent energy source." "Kind of like potato chip fat?" said Thomas Warchowski. "Actually, Thomas, spud clocks function differently. But let's talk about that after our timekeepers are up and running. Now, break into groups, grab your goggles, and get started. First one with a fully functional potato clock can activate the Franklin Sparks Pinwheel of Honor." That was all the incentive the class needed to split up and dash off to the table where Mr. Sparks had set out supplies. But initial enthusiasm soon subsided. "Hey, this isn't working," Lumpkin complained. "My potato must be busted." "Not likely," said Mr. Sparks. "I checked before class. All potatoes are in perfect working order. Fiddle with the wires. Spuds are just like regular batteries. If you don't use the right positive and negative electrodes, the juice won't flow." "Ours got going for a second or two," Thomas Warchowski called out, but then it stopped. "Keep trying," Mr. Sparks said. "Remember what Einstein said about mistakes." The class continued to tinker with the potatoes and pennies, the nails and clips. Here and there, students got their clocks going, but only for a short while. "Eureka!" Everyone turned toward PW, who was smiling from ear to ear. Mr. Sparks walked over to his bench. "Let's see what you've got," he said, After a brief inspection, Mr. Sparks said, "Nice job," and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a remote and handed it to PW. "Go ahead, give it a whirl." PW aimed the clicker and squeezed. Suddenly, the pinwheel at the front of the room began to spin and shed sparks. Once the fireworks had died down, Mr. Sparks claimed the remote and asked PW to explain how he started his potato clock. "I did the same thing I do whenever my Game Boy won't work," said PW. "I licked the ends of the batteries." Sparks nodded approvingly. "I never cease to marvel at the virtues of human saliva. It is, without a doubt, the most versatile non-Newtonian semi-solid known to man, except possibly for ketchup." "Really?" PW said excitedly. "Really," said Mr. Sparks. "You can see for yourselves how well spit conducts energy. Remove the clips from your digital clocks and very gently touch them to your tongues. Do not squeeze open the alligator clip." Flossie Parmigiano was the first to register a reaction. "I feel a tingle," she called out. "Me too," cried Thomas Warchowski. "Yup," said Leon. "I feel it. Kind of a zappy sensation." "Well, that zappy sensation," said Mr. Sparks, "is the movement of electrons. It's the same thing that lights up a football stadium, that sends astronauts to the moon, and that keeps potato chips rolling off an assembly line." Leon raised his hand. "Are you telling us human spit powers the potato clock?" "Not exactly," said Mr. Sparks. "Spit helps the process, but it's the potato acting as a battery that keeps the spud ticking. The potato is key to changing chemical energy into electrical energy." "Ow!" An ear-piercing scream interrupted the lesson. Everyone turned toward Lumpkin, who was suddenly running around the lab with a potato dangling from his tongue like a Christmas tree ornament. Leon shouldn't have snickered, but he did. And what's worse, Lumpkin saw him. "No, Henry," cried Mr. Sparks. "You weren't supposed to clamp the clip to your tongue. Just gently touch it." He caught up with Lumpkin near the fish tank and administered first aid before sending him off to the nurse. "So," said Mr. Sparks after things settled down, "did all of you feel a tingle?" "Yes," the fifth graders shouted, with 3 in particular shouting louder than the rest.